Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And recently I had the good fortune to drive through beautiful Greeley, Colorado. It's a community in northern Colorado, out on the plains, a little ways away from those pesky mountains. Why would you want to be by those anyway? And this is where I went to high school. And while I was in high school, a new Burger King went in there, and it was beautiful. Now, I had worked at a Burger King before this one went in, and it was a dump. Not a nice Burger King at all. It smelled bad. You could smell it on my clothes when I came home. But this new one, it had all the new branding. It was luxurious. The soda fountain was beautiful. The whole thing just felt ultra modern. And best of all, they took checks. So I could write a check for $3.17 and I could get a Whopper combo. And I didn't have to have any cash or anything. I just had that checkbook in the glove box of my car. It was the most amazing thing ever. And at the time, it seemed like the upscale place to go because it was in the fancy part of town and everything about it looked immaculate and perfect. And I, again, had the good fortune to drive past there not too long ago. And that Burger King is in not, how can I put this? It's just not in as good a shape anymore. It doesn't seem to. It aged real fast. All of the sensibilities come and go really quickly now. Fads turn over quick. Advertising campaigns come and then burn out and then they go away. And just in general, stuff has very little staying power in terms of buildings or locations that might have had significance to you once. They come and go really, really quick. So it is mind-boggling to me when I open the Bible to Nehemiah chapter 1 and I see a dude who lived in ancient Persia before anybody on that half of the planet even knew that the half of the planet I live on even existed. I open to this passage and I see Nehemiah referencing stuff that is about Jerusalem and the temple, a building that when it was first built had been dedicated 500 plus years before Nehemiah even lived. That is 3,000 years ago for you and I as we are sitting here talking right now. And it still matters. It's still a huge deal. That building was more than a building. It meant a whole giant thing. It's a part of a much larger story about all of humanity and all of history right up to this very day. And I just don't make them like they used to. No one is ever going to say the things I just said about Solomon's Temple regarding the Burger King on 35th Street in Greeley, Colorado. It's not going to happen. But I mentioned yesterday that Nehemiah was a guy who understood the rules of overtime. He understood the ground rules of the Old Testament and the deal between God and his chosen people. His prayer and his priorities are reflective of that in this action-packed opening chapter of Nehemiah. We looked at the humble opening stanza of his prayer. It's just lovely. It demonstrates getting-itness and self-awareness. But then yesterday we started to get into stanza, clause, chunk, paragraph. I don't know, how do you divide up prayers? I don't know what you call it. The next part of the prayer, starting in verse 8. And I told you there's a nod here back to older, very significant stuff, and it's a nod back to the original temple stuff. We'll probably take some time today and tomorrow to talk about it because it's a real big deal. All right, Nehemiah 1:8, once again, picking it up in the middle of his prayer. Remember the instructions you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you're unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But, and this is the part where it starts to sound a little bit like a negotiation, a thing that they did back then with God. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to a place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. And by bringing up to God those words that God said earlier, Nehemiah is invoking a whole history of stuff. And so let's start by going to where God said those words. And do I know exactly where that is off the top of my head? No, it's important for me to remind you from time to time. Heck no, I have no clue. I know about kind of where it is and sort of what book, but I got to look this stuff up just to be clear. It's down here in the Bible. The people who made the Bible were like, you probably don't know where that actually got said, do you? And I was like, no, people who made the Bible, I don't know where that got said. And so they put a note down here that's like, well, it just happens to be right here. But I wonder if they actually knew that or if they had to look it up too. Because it's a big book, and it's okay if you don't remember where all the things are off the top of your head. Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 through 5. And when I turn there, what I see is that, okay, yeah, I remember this business. This is part of the stuff where Moses and the Israelites, they're out in the desert, and they're getting a better sense of what the deal is with God. It's already been largely laid out clear back in Exodus, but there's clarification as you go along through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy as to what all the details and the terms of this very big, sweeping covenant is between God and man. So when we talk about the covenant with Noah, I can just take you right to the part with Noah at the beginning of Genesis and be like, right there, that's where it is, because it's just quick and it's smoking gun. You turn the page just like right here to Genesis 12, and you want to be like, oh, well, where's the covenant with Abram? Well, it's right there. It's super easy. And then there's also a second little bit that comes up a few pages later where God explains a bit more about that covenant there. If you want to know where's the covenant with David, that one's not too tough. I mean, you might not remember the exact passage, but you can go and figure it out, and it's all more or less in just one chapter. And so all of these Old Testament covenants, deals are pretty tight, except for the Moses one. The big one that spurs on most of the action is multifaceted, and it's in multiple places. And so there's sort of a renewal, a clarification of it all that is happening here. In Deuteronomy, it takes several chapters. In chapter 28, you get more of that explicit list of what the blessings and curses are. I'll tell you who did know all of this stuff off the top of his head, though, is Nehemiah. He knew the ground rules, and it's very clear in how he's praying. And then in chapter 29, we get details about the land and God's promise, about how they're going to be a people and that their peopleness and that their connectedness with God is going to be linked to their living in this particular land that God has promised to them for a really long time. And then chapter 30 apparently is basically the last chapters where we kind of round out this restatement and clarification of this whole deal, this whole covenant. And this, my friends, is what Nehemiah was referencing back to. Deuteronomy 30, verse 1. Remember, here's how Nehemiah said it. Keep your antenna out for this. He says, remember the instruction you gave to your servant Moses, saying, quote, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations, but if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Okay, now back to what he's quoting. Deuteronomy 30, verse 1. When all these blessings and curses I have set before you come upon you, and you take them to heart wherever the Lord your God disperses you among the nations, and when you and your children return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and with all your soul, according to everything I command you today, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you, and gather you again from all the nations where he scattered you. Even if you have been banished to the most distant land under the heavens, from there the Lord your God will gather you and bring you back. He will bring you to the land that belonged to your forefathers, and you will take possession of it. He will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. So it looks like Nehemiah, and I got to think Ezra as well, and I got to think probably a lot of the people in this whole exile saga that started back 150 years before the stuff we're looking at in Ezra and Nehemiah, I got to think that all of these people have this little bit that God said to them in Deuteronomy 30 front of mind. Things are very bad. Our culture is badly damaged. Our hearts are badly damaged. We live very far from home, and it is in ruin. But God himself made it explicitly, abundantly clear that there was a restoration clause in all of this blessings and curses deal that he was making, that no matter where you are, no matter how dispersed you are, my chosen people, my children, if there is some sort of repentance and return, if you learn from all of these blessings and curses I have set before you, if your hearts become awakened to that, and you obey God with all your heart and all your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and will have compassion on you and gather you again from the nations. That clause is explicit. You just heard it with your ears too. So it isn't totally presumptuous for somebody like Nehemiah to hearken back to an absolutely binding deal that has been confirmed by gajillions of witnesses through stuff that breaks the laws of time and space, not just circumstances over, let me see, from Deuteronomy 30 to the time of Nehemiah, 800, 1,000 years worth of time. It's a huge sample size. It's not unreasonable for Nehemiah to look at that and be like, hey, you said this. I think it's reasonable for me to remind you of this. I can't vouch for everybody, God, but you just heard my prayer. My heart is what you said our heart would need to be in order for this clause to kick in. I am circumspect. I am ashamed of my sin. I own it. I own it along with all of us. If I could own it for all of us, I would, and I will try. He's trying to model exactly the kind of heart that God said he would need to see in order to activate this clause. Then Nehemiah pivots right into the stuff that we've been reading today, quoting back to God this promise that God gave to them in Deuteronomy 30. And clearly, I mean, come on, you're smart. The case that Nehemiah is trying to make is, I am trying to nurture a right heart and a right posture before you. Implicit in this is, would you help all of us to do that? And if so, would you please honor and activate this part of the deal between us that you said you would honor and activate? And clearly, God has been in the process of doing that, but it's still all in jeopardy, as we've discussed so much, because the lack of the walls and the people continue to be wobbly in their standing there in relation to what's going on outside of them, but also still in relation to what's going on inside of them. Remember, we're trying to rebuild a city, we're trying to rebuild structural things, but we're also trying to rebuild a people. But my friends, as I mentioned at the outset of our conversation today, this is not the only thing that Nehemiah's prayer is hearkening back to. He's also hearkening back to stuff that happened around the time of the dedication of the Temple of Solomon, when that promise from God in Deuteronomy 30 that we were just looking at gets renewed again. So it's not like it's even been 1,000 years since God brought this clause up. It's happened much more recently than that, and Nehemiah's prayer is also a nod to that, and we'll go see what that is all about next time around. That's plenty for now. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.